Hi, everyone. My name is Shandy Hilton, and I am the General Manager for the Caribbean Alternative Investment Association, also known as CARIA. I'm thrilled to welcome you to the second episode of our webinar series, Beyond the Portfolio. And here today, we are going to be looking at the topic of climate financing and the blue economy. But real quick, just want to give you some information about CARIA. We are a dynamic nonprofit that represents entities involved in the alternative investment sector, including private equity, private credit, venture capital, and real estate. A major part of our mandate is to support capacity development and awareness of alternative investment in the Caribbean. So today, as you know, we will be focusing on climate financing, which is a crucial, and the blue economy, which are crucial for the shaping of the future of our region. To lead us on this exciting journey, we have a highly qualified and passionate host, Ms. Jodykay Maxwell, who has over a decade of experience leading high-impact projects for the IDB, World Bank Group, and the UN Environment Program. She is currently the Associate Director for Environmental Credit Risk Management at CIBC Caribbean, and she holds, among other things, a Master of Philosophy in Engineering from Cambridge University, a postgraduate diploma from the University of Oxford, and certification in renewable and climate finance from the Frankfurt School of Business. She is more than capable of charting the path for this well-needed discussion. So please sit back, relax, and enjoy our lunch special. Over to you, Jody.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Mrs. Hilton. I am very pleased and honored to have been selected to be a part of today's discussion and to lead our panel through this very important topic. I want to take this time out to welcome everyone who will be joining us today, and special shout out to my colleagues who are joining from CIBC Caribbean. So today, this is really an opportunity to gain a better understanding of the financing opportunities that exist for blue economy projects, specifically in terms of learning from the multilateral financing lens, seeking information as well from the investment fund management lens, and also hearing the unique perspective of private sector organization who have successfully engaged and acquired funding to support these activities. So I'm very happy to be here and to share in today's journey as we have this discussion. I wanted to just apologize for technological glitch that's happening. I'm incapable of turning on my camera, and so that we don't delay any further, we're just going to continue on. So, starting with my introduction to our esteemed panelists, I want to start off first with Miss Justine Powell. Justine is the Assistant Vice President. She is at my top right corner, top left, sorry. She's the Assistant Vice President for Investment Management at Signos, where she's responsible for the management of Signos's alternate investment platform. She has close to a decade of experience spanning actuarial consulting, fund management, risk management, and risk analytics. Now, to my bottom right hand corner is Miss Malini Samtani. Miss Malini Samtani is a climate change officer at the IDB Invest, which is a private sector arm of the Inter-American Development Bank Group. She brings a wealth of knowledge to this topic in terms of her extensive experience in developing green lending lines and integrating climate change considerations across the portfolio. She's also done work on blue bonds, specifically around engaging corporations' participation in the blue economy. And even more recently, I would have sat in on a Jamaica Stock Exchange blue bond framework where Miss Malini is also supporting, working with IDB to support this framework in Jamaica. And to my bottom left corner is Mr. Roderick Francis Jr. Now, Mr. Roderick Francis is the CEO of BND Trawling, and BND Trawling is one of our largest exporters of seafood. He would have also had significant experience as the vice president of the formerly called Jamaica Exporters Association, now called JMEA, Jamaica Manufacturing and Exporters Association. He's also served on Jamaica Chamber of Commerce as a representative of the board of the Port Royal Brotherhood. Now, thank you for joining us, panelists, today. As we may be aware, Jamaica, like many developing states, face significant threats from macroeconomic shocks, as well as from climate change shocks. And so, being an economy that is completely dependent on our coastline, particularly in terms of tourism, we are highly vulnerable to the acute effects of climate change. Now, this brings to the importance of the blue economy, and the blue economy really speak to fisheries and all the activities that we derive by virtue of our coastal geographic location. And these benefits have become particularly important because of late, there has been a number of studies and research on the blue economy space. In fact, the Caribbean Policy Research Institute would have published a recent report that speak to how you can really seize the opportunities that exist in this sector. Lastly, the World Bank Group has also developed a roadmap for Jamaica. And so I want to, based on that context, I want to reach over to Ms. Samtini to tell us or take us through in terms of how IDB Invest is going about identifying and prioritizing investment in this space. You know, Jamaica now has a roadmap. What exactly is IDB Invest doing in terms of identifying and prioritizing this very important sector?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the introduction and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me start by saying that the conversation around environmental projects and the green economy has been happening for a long time. And over time, what we started seeing was that companies were lending to green finance projects. So think about renewable energy as, the classic example. And there's more guides over these years, there's multiple issuances, and we get really specific and it becomes more sophisticated. And a couple of years ago, the conversation started about the blue economy because when we talk about the green economy, we're covering everything. We're covering land-based, we're covering ocean-based, but really we needed more specialized guidance on the blue economy. And so conversation started about how do we define this? And what we found in our own work is traditionally when we spoke about the blue economy, it was about marine conservation. But we found that it's about all the businesses that are, or all the economic activity that happens in the water. So when you think about things like ports, when you think about things like marine transportation, seafood production, all of these are happening in the water, tourism. But there's also a lot of land-based companies that have an impact primarily through pollution on the ocean. And if you don't help these land-based companies to have better practices, they're going to keep impacting the ocean. So it's really, really important to start changing those practices, start upgrading those practices over time. And that upgrading of those practices in the land-based sectors, but also in the ocean-based sectors, is what we would call blue finance. So when we think about things like the circular economy, you wouldn't immediately think about, well, what's the connection with the blue economy? But what we're saying here is actually if companies use packaging that won't ultimately plastic, if you're using less plastic, it doesn't ultimately land up in the sea. Water and sanitation, if you're treating water and sanitation and it's all land-based, but ultimately if it lands up in the sea, it needs to be treated so that it doesn't affect marine biodiversity. So all of these things, all of these different aspects of the economy, all of these businesses have a role to play in the blue economy. What we do at IDB Invest, in addition to doing some of this thought leadership, 2 years ago, we published our Blue Bonds in Latin America paper, and since then we've had multiple blogs. So in addition to creating that thought leadership, our main goal is to unlock climate finance, and increasingly recently it's environmental and green finance. A big part of that is blue finance. And so when we work with, since we're the private sector arm of the Inter-American Development Bank Group, when we work with a bank or a seafood company or a water and sanitation project, we look at the project to see, well, is there opportunity for blue finance? Can we add elements either through blue finance or through climate change mitigation, which means we reduce the emissions of the project, or through climate change adaptation. And this is particularly important in countries like Jamaica, where, wind, heat, these are all factors that are increasing in intensity and frequency. So what can we do in the project to make sure that the project is more resilient to climate change? So that's not necessarily the blue economy, that's more climate change, but often there's overlaps. All this to say that at IDB Invest, we work one on financing, that's a key component, but also in order to get to that blue, green, or climate finance, we work with companies to identify where the opportunities are and do market studies, feasibility studies, so that we can get to the financing.
Thank you very much for that, Malini. Very interesting and in-depth discussion around the different financing options. Now, I want to bring your attention that Cygnus was really recently selected to become the fund managers for US $135 million Caribbean Community Resilient Fund to deploy investments across renewable energy, blue economy, sustainable housing, ICT, transport, financial services, and climate smart agriculture. Now, Justine, tell us in terms of what do you see is Cygnus's role as the fund manager for this large fund, and what are some of the potential opportunities for prospective clients who may be online joining us today? As well as, is there, similar to Malini's question, are there any specific criteria that Cygnus would have been developing or considering in terms of, selecting projects? And you may speak generally, but I want for some concentration to be on how you go about this in consideration of blue economy activities.
Thank you so much, Jodykay. Thank you for having me today. I'm very excited to be here. So I think you asked about 3 questions just now. So the first one was, our role as fund manager for the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund. Before I get into our role, I kind of want to give an overview to the audience today, about the Caribbean Community Resilience Fund, which I'm going to call CRF for short. So it's a blended finance vehicle, and it's going to be focused on investments centered around climate resilience as well as economic sustainability, and it's going to be deploying capital right across the Caribbean. Now, the fund has been designed and developed, through collaborative efforts. So the CARICOM Development Fund, which I'll call CDF for short, is the main sponsor for the fund. So they would have been a part of those collaborative efforts, as well as USAID. And then more recently, Cygnus Capital as fund manager would have joined those efforts, as well as RMI, which stands for Rocky Mountain Institute. And they're going to play a role as technical advisor for the initiative. Now, the CRF is going to be investing across some key resilient sectors or themes, which Jodykay would have mentioned just now. So your blue economy, your climate smart agriculture, your renewable energy, financial services, ICT, and so on. So the fund is expected to play a very crucial role in the region. It's going to be channeling capital into projects, various initiatives, and these projects and initiatives are expected to really, mitigate and adapt to a lot of the adverse climate and economic shocks that we experience here in the Caribbean, especially related to climate change. In addition to that, what we're expecting is that the investments or the projects that we focus on are supposed to help to develop what we consider key infrastructure to achieve economic diversification across the region. So that's just high level, what the fund is expected to do. In terms of Cygnus's role, so the opportunity to manage the CRF, it aligns perfectly with Cygnus's goal, as a leader in alternative investment space in the Caribbean. We have an impressive track record, and we're well known for, innovation, tailored solutions, the outside of the box thinking. And what you find is that these qualities, alongside our understanding of the region, are going to be very important for the success of the CRF, because they basically cater to the nuances that exist in the Caribbean. So the fund is a $135 million fund, as Jodykay would have mentioned. And in terms of Cygnus's specific role, it's going to include day-to-day management of the investments within the portfolio. It's going to include, project and investment selection. It's going to include the capital raising efforts to actually get the capital to deploy. And it's going to just include being an excellent steward of shareholders' capital, which is something that we're very familiar with, something that we have been doing for the last 7 years. And Cygnus, if for those who aren't aware, currently has close to 450 million in assets under management. I think the next question you asked, Jodykay, was, what opportunities exist for investors? So many opportunities. I'm going to try and pick two, just to not, get carried away. 2 or 3. So the first opportunity, which I think is evident or obvious, is that you get a chance as a potential investor to contribute to a more sustainable region. Investing in an opportunity like the CRF means that you are contributing to the mobilization of capital, which is expected to create, a lasting social, economic, environmental impact across the region. So it's not just Jamaica. I wanted to make that clear. It's right across the region. Another opportunity for our potential investors is that the fund offers downside protection. So through the CRF, investors get an opportunity to benefit from what we are calling first loss capital, and this is up to 30 million US. Essentially, this first loss capital is going to come partly from the CDF, who's the sponsor for the fund, and it's going to, take a lower return. It's going to absorb some of the initial losses experienced by the portfolio, if any, and it's going to basically come off as patient concessional capital. So they're taking lower returns to allow the other investors to get higher returns. They are waiting longer to get their capital back to allow the other investors to get their capital first. And they are putting themselves in a position to absorb the initial losses that the fund may experience. So, that is also another attractive opportunity, or a selling point then for the investors. And the last thing I want to say, for our potential investors, is that they get to experience what I like to call the Cygnus difference. The Cygnus difference that I'm referring to here is just our ability to, at Cygnus, to create the most innovative, bespoke financial solutions, combining that skill set alongside our knowledge of the region, in terms of investment selection and capital raising. It is going to bode extremely well for the CRF. So, high level, those are some opportunities for potential investors. In terms of, selection criteria, I believe that was another question that was posed. How are we going to be selecting projects for funding through the CRF? So the first thing I want to say before I start to give any examples is that, we pride ourselves on, we have a very unique approach to sourcing and structuring the projects and investments that we deploy capital into. So there is not going to be an exhaustive list, but what I'll do is I'll share a few, key criteria that we may or may not look at. So one is that we're going to pay attention to the project focus. It's important that the project aligns with one of the key objectives of the CRF. So that's going to be very important. The next thing we're going to pay attention to is the sector focus. Does it fit into the key resilient sectors based on the CRF's mandate, such as, is it blue economy? Is it renewable energy? Is it financial services? So we're going to be paying attention to that for sure. Another thing that we're going to look at, and I guess this is a little bit more specific, we're going to look at the impact. Does this project benefit low income population? Does it create any jobs? Is it benefiting the unbanked sector? Does it align with any sustainable development goals? Does it positively impact a wide cross section of people? So those are some of the questions that we're going to have to answer in deploying the capital. The next thing that we look at, of course, is scalability. Is there potential for scaling up the investment or even better scaling it across the region? So that's something that we'll definitely look out for. We're going to pay attention to the management team. Do you have a capable project or management team behind the investment? And that is going to be very important because we want to ensure that the management team is capable enough to achieve the strategic objectives of the project or the company, and that is what will allow us to get back the capital, right, that we're deploying. So that's going to be key. And then you definitely have some more sector specific metrics. And I'll give a few examples. So for climate, for example, a criterion that we'll pay attention to, is this project increasing or reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and by how much? We're going to be looking at that. For example, for financial services, we may have metrics around non-performing loans, depending on the type of financial service entity that we're financing. For blue economy, a possible criterion that we would look at is, whether an aquaculture project, for example, has made deliberate efforts to mitigate water pollution. So that's an example of something that we'll pay attention to. And another one might be, are these ship emissions reducing, and by how much? So just to give a few examples of some of the things that we will be paying attention to when we're, selecting these investments. So over to you, Jodykay.
Thank you very much, Justine, for a very comprehensive understanding of what exactly Cygnus is looking for and what KPIs may be important in accordance to the sector or the project that persons would be interested in selecting. Now, I think we have a very unique perspective here where Roderick can really speak to what his experience would have been tapping into another fund, not the Cygnus Fund in this case, but the Compete Caribbean facility. And through that fund, Roderick and perhaps I think 10 other companies would have been able to compete, successfully attain the funds, and then also have gone on to attain Marine Stewardship Council certification, which is a very big deal and particularly a first for Jamaica. Now, with that example, Roderick, can you speak to your experience in accessing that fund in terms of what were the criteria? Justine would have spoken to some KPIs, if you can remember any type of KPIs that were crucial, any type of management structure. Just go through all the main criteria that you would have gone through with your team to attain that funding. Thank you so much.
Okay, sure. Thank you, Jodykay, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here to discuss with everyone the other side of the coin. We've heard from the lenders, and now you'll hear from the borrower who has a more difficult time. So, yeah, certainly, it was a very rigorous process in being able to access that fund. Specifically, our program, the program that went out, was for a blue economy grant. So we really I had to, hire the best grant writers around to help translate, my regular business thoughts into language that, a lender and a grant issuer would understand. So that's the first thing. Then after that, you really have to look at the impact, that the project is going to make, because we're competing basically with everybody in the Caribbean with this project. So just the first part of writing that grant is so difficult, and then getting shortlisted. After the shortlist process, then I had to prepare a presentation. I think everybody had 5 minutes, and compete against everybody else in the Caribbean. And they were only choosing, out of 20 presentations, they were only choosing the top 3. And I'm very happy to say that, we were able to access that funding. And I think a big part of it was because of the impact that we made, not only on the blue economy, but also, the coastal communities in the blue economy. So it hit several marks, because when you think about the blue economy, and especially like fishing, you always think about overfishing, people going out catching less catch, and we've received, you know, the real downside of it. Our industry was closed for 2 years, and I cannot tell you what devastation that did to, you know, a lot of our community members that work in our processing facilities, the fishermen that work for us, that we buy our products from. So we wanted to be able to, you know, have this third-party certification to make sure that, you know, we have international eyes looking over to make sure that we never have this shutdown again. So in terms of impact, we are buying from fishermen probably in the region of $400 million a month of product from them. And imagine what impact that makes to those families, how many, you know, more school books they can buy, how many more food, things like that they can buy. And these are subsistence earners. So another aspect of it, you know, and this eco-label certification is that it's now becoming a standard in international markets. And being exporters, we export mainly to Europe, USA, also a lot to Asia, and it's now becoming, you know, a market access hurdle. The first question, or maybe the second question after you describe what product they ask, is, do you have any sustainable certifications? The end customer wants to know about it. The distributors want to know about it. And, you know, if you have that certification, you get an edge. And also it allows you to tap into additional markets. Like Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, which only sells like sustainable certified products, that kind of region. So now we're able to go up the value chain and also access more valuable retail markets. So it's significantly important. And lastly, you know, what I'd like to add is that with this kind of certification, I've been noticing that we now have access to additional capital. So there's a lot of money out there right now in terms of funds really looking to fund blue economy projects, impact investment projects. And what it has done, it has really opened us up to a sector where we can, most importantly, get non-traditional financing. Because when you look at financing in Jamaica, you're looking at high interest rates, number one. You're looking at asset-backed borrowing. So if you're going to borrow 10 million US, you need some kind of asset that's worth 20 million US to be able to borrow that 10 million US. Now, going into, you know, these donor funds, which a lot of them are backed by, you know, UK aid, Government of Canada, US aid, all of these funds, we're able to now access with this kind of sustainable certification as a sort of collateral to say that, okay, you know, we are investing in a sustainable resource, and we're able to fund this company now because we have this third-party certification that is making sure that this resource is going to last for the tenure of the loan and forevermore. And we're also making this huge impact on, you know, the environment and as well as the livelihoods of persons within that coastal environment.
Thank you for that, Roderick. So some key points I'm hearing from you is that consumer preferences is certainly shifting. And of course, there is a lot more opportunities with regards to funding opportunities opening up for prospective investors and private sector companies. And of course, lastly, that sustainability is a very important investment criteria in all of this in terms of the impact on the community and other other opportunities. Now, Malini, B&D trawling is really a great example of what a good blue economy project can look like. Can you share from an IDB perspective what other best practices or standards are out there that you could share with the audience in terms of what could potential or prospective clients or investors look for or look to in terms of a standard that you can perhaps share?
Absolutely. And Roderick, it was really a pleasure to hear from your perspective how the process works. Roderick mentioned through his Compete Caribbean competition, if you will, going from the business language, because of course businesses know what they're doing, they know what they're doing best, and there's always room for improvement, but often in a case like this one, the core business is to be more sustainable. But then you need to take the process of translating that in a way that investors understand and in a way that the market understands and showcase it with certifications like he did. And so from IDB Invest's perspective, a lot of what we try to do, given our mandate, is one, do loans, so green loans, blue loans. But more often than not, when we get to the point of green loans and blue loans, we try to take it to the point of bonds. And when it comes to bonds, so let's say a company in Jamaica, as an example, is looking to issue a bond. And earlier today, Jodykay, you mentioned that there will be a guide on thematic bonds, and to date, there actually hasn't been a thematic bond yet in Jamaica. There have been only two in the Caribbean, one in Barbados, one in Trinidad, but it's a space that is growing. So bringing this back to thematic bonds, as of this week or next week, there will be a guide that I would encourage all of you to look at that looks at what are the criteria for a company, regardless of which sector you're in, to issue a green, social, or a sustainable bond. And part of that is also the blue bond. At IDB Invest, we look at ICMA, so the International Capital Markets Association guidance for blue bonds. And that is, global guidance that you could use anywhere in the world, but increasingly we're seeing countries issue their own bond in the way that Jamaica will. So we look at sustainability certifications. Often water and wastewater projects or treatment projects are another category that we would look at because of the impact it has, as well as circular economy projects. And then within that, in any project that has a blue label, it would have to have some categories of impact and key performance indicators. So we spoke about climate change mitigation. So there the indicator would be, well, through these projects that are either water-based or have an impact on the water, how much are you reducing your emissions? It could also have a core focus around climate change adaptation, which means how are you becoming more resilient? It could have natural resources and biodiversity conservation. So think about coral reefs and mangroves, how it has, it really has a thriving marine life and marine biodiversity, and it's very important to keep it that way, restore it and conserve it. So if we think about sustainable tourism projects, a hotel that's building a new property or hotel company that's building a new property on the coast, these are things that they may want to consider when they're thinking about, well, they're getting all these tourists for their coral reef and part, so how do they want to protect it? Also, coral reefs and mangroves both have a lot of benefits in flood protection, which is becoming an increasing increasing problem, sorry. So thinking about those things when you're looking at construction and thinking about climate change resilience will be very important. One thing I would say from our perspective at IDB Invest, we tend to have larger projects in sectors, and what we found particularly in the blue economy, because it's newer, is that working through banks that can then lend onward has been quite helpful. So as an example, a bank may go and issue a blue bond, and then it doesn't only work with one sector because it has multiple smaller clients, multiple smaller projects that it can aggregate into one blue bond. So it may have, for example, fisheries that are looking to get certified or have gotten certified. It may have water treatment. It may have food packaging companies that are now looking at circular economy um, production, and they need CapEx to be able to move their business model. So once the bank issues this blue bond, they're then able to go onward and create these blue lending lines that I would expect that we would increasingly see in Jamaica and the Caribbean, where these banks offer green lending lines, blue lending lines that are specifically tagged and you can look out for.
Thank you for that, Malini. So I'm hearing that there are a lot of best practices and a lot of instruments that are accessible to prospective investors. You spoke to bonds, you spoke to the ICMA framework. You also spoke to potential investors ascertaining various certifications. And I think Roderick would have also shared on his experience with that. We are also sharing about the Jamaica Stock Exchange's thematic bond that is currently being developed and expected to be executed shortly. So there are a number of different avenues and opportunities and even best practices that are out there in terms of what is accessible to prospective clients and investors. Roderick, I also wanted to just hone in on your experience in terms of what improvements you would have done to your operations as a result of accessing these funds.
Well, I would say, there are significant improvements. The project, the MSc certification was just one part of the project, actually. So another part of the project is the modernizing of the kind of legislation is in the business. Also, another part is doing creating a value-added portions so that we can create more value from the same raw material. So I think it significantly improves the look of Jamaica as a whole, but to be the first Queen Conch certified fishery in the world, I think that's pretty big. And to show that we're leading the sector in terms of innovation with value-added items and modernizing our legislation and things like that. But we would have had a continuous improvement process. So actually, the first process started in 2005, where we did a pre-assessment for the MSc certification. So when they did and came and did the pre-assessment, they highlighted some changes that things that we needed to improve. So it was actually a long process to come up to do those improvements before we actually went out and tried to get the funds to actually do the current audit. So it was a process of improving up to, and then the whole MSc certification and process is that they do an audit every year and a full review every 5 years. So always there are things to improve. So every time they come and identify, and it's a continuous improvement program to make sure that you're really making the best impact. Hope that answered your question.
It did. It certainly did. Thank you for that. No, Malini, you would have spoken to, just how private sector, such as banking institution, can play a part or play a larger role in this respect. And I wanted to hear from both yourself, Justine, and Roderick as well, in terms of how do you see private sector? So you can speak to the multilateral financing lens, and then Justine, you can speak to your lens from a fund manager. How do you see private sector playing a more significant part in advancing this climate financing and climate resilient opportunities in the region?
Sure. So look, from a private sector perspective, a lot of investors have gone out and made commitments, whether that's we plan to be net zero by 2050, or we plan to have X hundred of millions of dollars in green finance. So they have all of these commitments. And now comes the part where they have to implement it. So definitely the supply of the financing is there. They have pressure now to support, and that's where our role as an MDB comes in, because we need to connect the dots, right, between the investors, but also create these projects, or help business people create these projects that are bankable through technical assistance, to prepare these businesses to then receive that sustainable financing. There is a broader conversation around the Paris Agreement. So countries everywhere have committed to, keeping global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees and no more than 2 degrees. And at the same time, for a long time now, there's been a realization that the governments alone are not going to achieve this, because the amount of investment that's required and the kind of action that's required to actually keep to that 1.5, and also deal with even if we keep to that 1.5 or 2 degrees, deal with the climate change impacts, the flooding, the heat, the wind that is already happening. All across the Caribbean, it requires private sector investment. And so businesses are looking at this from both a risk and an opportunity perspective. The risk perspective is, well, if we don't act, if our projects aren't more sustainable from a business person's perspective or from an investor's perspective, if we don't invest in more sustainable projects, then there's a transition risk, because there's all of these commitments to be more sustainable, and suddenly our business or our investments become stranded assets because we're not participating. So that's the risk side. The opportunity side is that there's so much happening, and so you may as well act before this becomes, a regulatory requirement, because now when you act, you're allowed to make mistakes, you're allowed to pilot, you're allowed to test, because it's not a regulation yet. But that will happen in the future. There will be more competition in the future internationally to remain competitive as a local business. Internationally, Roderick spoke to this. It requires you to have certain sustainability upgrades. And so it's really important to start acting both from the investor's perspective, but also from a business person's perspective on the sustainability front. And one way to do that is through the blue economy.
Thank you for that, Justine. Any word on that?
Sure. So I think the private sector has a significant role to play. So I agree with a lot of what Malini would have said. So some additional ways that I think the private sector can contribute is, one, through the financing mechanisms that they create. They have to become more innovative. And I guess in the context of the CRF, private sector entities like Signos are able to develop unique instruments to meet the needs of the capital seekers, or the investees. That's going to be very important, especially when we consider where we are in the Caribbean as it relates to, climate change and climate action. So the solutions that we come up with are going to have to, be able to support that channeling of capital into the climate related projects, especially, those large scale projects, whether it's your renewable energy installations or even, a waste to energy project. So I think the financing mechanisms is going to be key. Another way that the sector can contribute to just overall climate financing is through public-private partnerships, or P3 projects, as we commonly refer to them as. This is going to be, I think, a significant role for the private sector to play, especially with, again, those large-scale climate projects, and it's more than just contributing financially here or facilitating or creating that capital. I think the private sector also, for these types of projects, they're able to improve the efficiency as well as the overall economics of the projects. They're generally much more adept for those kind of things. So that is something else that another way I think the private sector can contribute. And lastly, I think just being overall an advocate for the sector and for these kind of themes. So the private sector is going to need to lobby for regulatory frameworks and policies to support climate financing and these sustainable practices, and that's going to go a long way in moving us in the right direction. I think when we get to that point of having robust governance, it's going to do a lot for not just Jamaica but the overall region. So I think the private sector will have to play a part in that as well.
Thank you for that, Justine. Roderick, any word from you in relation to how other prospective private sector clients can, access and how they can play a role in this?
Yeah, I think Justine hit the nail on the head. With the the direction of going to really create this kind of financing system where it's not the regular run-of-the-mill system. It's tailored to what the companies, the borrowers need, and to make sure that they get the maximum impact. When you look at traditional bank financing in Jamaica, and I'm glad I'm on this platform. They have a saying, banks only lend money to people who have money. And in Jamaica, it's much easier to get a loan for a car, which is a depreciating asset, than to get a loan for your business, and that's just the reality. So we have to have a change, I think, in mindset of also the lending institutions. I know Cygnus has always been at the forefront of this kind of bespoke lending. But the regular, normal institutions are going to have to catch up as well and be able to create, these financing vehicles that help improve the economy for sustainable, long-term, and not based on this kind of asset-based backed borrowing. So, some have to move away. So when in America or Europe, if you have a company that is cash flowing, they lend money off cash flow, right? They don't necessarily have to put their house on the line, these things on the line. So, we have to think about things like that and how we modernize our sector to be able to fuel the growth of our economy and move Jamaica forward.
Thank you for that last word. I'm understanding that private sector really do have a larger role to play, especially because of the fact that climate change risk is increasingly materializing across businesses. And even so, the large financing gap makes it even more important for regulatory changes, lending in terms of the requirements and agility and scope of lending has to change. Robust governance and other areas are increasingly important for private sector to kind of grasp these opportunities. With that, I would like to just say a very well thank you to our panelists who have participated in this session. I know that we have a couple of questions from the audience, so I'm just going to jump into that. Roderick, for you, one of our guests asked where and how can you go about getting the sustainability certification? So they may have joined late, so just walk us through quickly in a minute or two of how you went about ascertaining the certification from MSC.
Right. So it depends on what industry you're in, but in our industry, which is wild caught fishery, MSC is the gold standard worldwide of eco-labeling for wild caught seafood. So you know, when you go into a supermarket in the US or Europe, you'll look at your seafood packaging and you'll see this blue label with a tick. And worldwide, it's very well known. So it depends on what that certification is for depends on what field you're in, right? So this is MSC is specifically for wild-caught fisheries, but there may be other instances where you have like an organic certification or zero carbon footprint certification. I'm not so familiar with those, but once you find the eco label that you're interested in, it's just a process of actually reaching out to them, looking at the criteria that you need to meet for this certification, looking at the financial obligations of the certification, and really look and see if this is something that you can manage. If not, you can't manage, try to go ahead and get a grant to assist you with not only just writing the grant process. I know there maybe DBJ used to do that sometimes, help to assist you to just write the grant, to get the money to put these different things in place that you need to get the certification done. So it's very rare that, in a new company or a new instance that you will have all of these criteria checked off. As I mentioned to you earlier, it took us over 10 years to really check off that criteria in the beginning before we even went for the full certification. So I would say just identify the institution that you want, look at what the parameters are, and go for it.
Thank you for that. There is a question here. As a media professional with an engineering background and a passion for renewable energy, I have spent 6 years in the orange economy. Recently, I've become interested in research and development in eco-friendly products with a biochemist. As we focus on R&D, how can I seek assistance on the business aspect without risking idea theft and ensuring continued involvement and recognition? I don't know who want to, which of you, maybe Roderick again, you could take that one, and then we open to
Sure.
the floor to everyone for any questions that they may have.
Yeah, sure. That's a very good question. And, research and development is always very expensive, right? So, large companies have research and development budgets, which they can, take money out and create new products and services. If you're a startup, it's going to be extremely difficult for you to do that, especially if you're starting with limited cash flow in your business. So you really need to look out for a grant, and there are a lot of grants out there that help you do things like this. IDB would be, a donor to many programs under DBJ and other vehicles to be able to access grants that help you do these kind of things to develop. So my first instance would be, again, try to get some funding to help you write your project in that grant format, which is extremely difficult. Get funding for that, and then once you get that funding and hopefully you'll win the grant, you go and you have your independent consultants that help you. Otherwise, there is another route, and I heard you speak about confidentiality, and this is the problem that I see with the Scientific Research Council. You can get the develop things like this with the Scientific Research Council here, but the problem is that whatever formulation you come up with is public. So that's the reason I, really haven't worked much with the Scientific Research Council. I always try to do it on my own, try to get that funding and do it yourself so you can have your competitive advantage.
Thank you so much. Opening the floor now to our live audience. Please feel free to open your mic and pose the question to any of our panel members. If there are no questions, then I will just turn over to Mrs. Hilton for closing remarks. Just want to say again, I'm very pleased and honored to share stage with Justine, Malini, and Roderick on this topic. It's very important to have open discussion around this topic and to have good examples and opportunities of where we can. Oh, there's a question from Gerard. Do you want to open your mic, Gerard, and perhaps ask the question? Okay. Let me just read it for him. What would countries place?
Okay, so sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Mr. Johnson. Go ahead.
Okay, Jerry here. Yeah, no, it's just from years and years of programming investments with sovereigns around Latin America and in the Caribbean. Although I think it's be hard to argue that the blue economy does not deserve very high priority. And as you know, in most of the cases in the Caribbean, the name of the country has to be written in the ocean because it can't fit inside the country because they're so small. And so obviously, one of our most valuable assets is the sea. Nevertheless, for all the money that may be put on the table, I remember year after year, money was left on the table because the priority that the bank may have was not necessarily the same as the sovereign that had to borrow the money. And I'm wondering, I know in the conversation today, I signed in late, so maybe you already covered this. But obviously, I think the art of development is aligning priorities with the client who actually borrows the money. The IDB doesn't take is not making the investment, the government is. And I was wondering if maybe, I know the session is over, if you could take less time than my question took to discuss it. Thanks.
Okay. I don't know if Malini wants to answer that, but I think, Jerry, from what we have been seeing is that the government have signaled an interest in starting to shore up funding in terms of blue economy. And so there are a number of different initiatives that have been taking place in the space. For instance, the Jamaica Stock Exchange Blue Bond framework, which is being developed. So that is just one piece of the puzzle. And Justine Powell, who sits at Cygnus, would have spoken to the $135 million fund that they also have to support these kind of projects. So the market, the government, and different players have been signaling the importance of this particular economic activities. And I don't know if Malini wants to complement and then hand over to Shanley to close. Thank you.
Sure, maybe just very briefly, good to see you, Gerard. And I would say, it's a good point, and I work on the private sector, so I can't comment as much on the government or on the public side. But what I will say is that I think priorities are changing over time. More and more, we're hearing about ocean states, we're hearing about job creation through the ocean, nature and biodiversity are becoming a big topic. So I think it's gaining traction.
Thank you for that, Malini.
Thank you. Thank you.
If there's no other question, then I know we are running a bit late, so I will just hand over to Shanley to close.
Wonderful. Thank you, my wonderful, inspiring panelists and hosts. This was a very exciting discussion. I learned quite a bit. So I probably need to be reaching out to Signals shortly about that fund for my new ideas. And thank you so much, Roderick, for sharing from your own personal perspective. I mean, this has been an exciting group of persons speaking to us about their own experiences and expertise. And I'm just so thankful that you were able to stay with us. And to our guests, thank you for staying for the time that we've had. Yes, we know it was 45 minutes planned, but because the discussion was so rich, I appreciate you all staying with us and going through. Now, you can join us next month on June 26th, where we'll be looking into private equity and, you know, just exploring how companies can access funding and how the companies that have access funding, similar to how Roderick spoke about his grant experience, we'll also have examples from at least one company speaking about their experience for private equity. So we're continuing on this trajectory. Karaya enjoys providing this information to all of you, and we'll bring you more next month. Thank you again, my panelists. Thank you all, and have a wonderful rest of your day. All the best.